Every Friday evening, more than 15 million people across Britain push open the heavy oak doors of their local public houses for a quiet pint. But very few realise this simple weekly habit was born not from modern leisure, but from a brutal, desperate fight for human survival. The freezing wind bites at the back of a tired factory worker's neck, the damp cold seeping into their bones after a relentless 10-hour shift. They reach out, grasping a worn brass handle polished by generations of rough hands, and heave the heavy timber inward to escape the elements. Instantly, the harsh industrial world is completely shut out, replaced by a sudden wall of golden heat from a roaring coal fire and the comforting low acoustic hum of familiar neighborhood voices. The distinct smell of roasted barley malt, spilled cask ale, and damp wool coats fills the confined air as they step into a communal sanctuary that has stubbornly stood against the encroaching darkness and urban isolation for more than 10 unbroken centuries. This sudden physical transition from the unforgiving rain-slicked street to a warm, shared neighborhood hearth represents the invisible social architecture that actively built a nation's collective spirit. Urban sociologists now recognize this specific threshold as the ultimate third space, a vital neutral ground separate from the demanding hierarchies of the workplace and the private confines of the home, where rigid class structures temporarily dissolve into a shared pint glass. Think of a specific time you stood in the exact center of a bustling metropolitan city, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of rushing strangers, yet felt completely, crushingly alone in the crowd. That distinct modern ache of urban alienation is actually an ancient human pain, and this highly specific architectural room was meticulously engineered over hundreds of years to cure that exact psychological deficit through forced proximity and shared physical space. The traditional public house is not merely a commercial retail space that sells alcoholic beverages. It operates as a living monument to our deep biological evolutionary need for tribal connection when the external world feels far too vast and dangerously cold. The narrow physical dimensions of the wooden bar force patrons to sit shoulder to shoulder within a 30-inch radius, aggressively stripping away the digital isolation of modern life and silently demanding that we acknowledge the breathing human being sitting right beside us. That enforced physical closeness slowly and methodically melts away the invisible psychological armor we wear throughout the workday, lowering defensive postures and encouraging direct eye contact. Over the course of a single evening, this subtle environmental conditioning turns highly isolated individuals into a unified, fiercely protective local community bound by shared geography and mutual recognition. To truly understand exactly how deep this biological need goes, we have to step all the way back into the terrifying, disease-ridden darkness of the 11th century Middle Ages. The very first rudimentary versions of these public gathering places, historically known as domestic alehouses, absolutely did not begin with a grand commercial business plan or any frivolous desire for evening entertainment. They were born from pure biological survival, usually started by an enterprising local woman, officially known as an alewife, who fermented a weak, low-alcohol beer of around 1 or 2% simply because drinking the bacteria-filled local river water was a deadly daily gamble. The boiling process required for brewing accidentally purified the liquid, and she would hang a green bush or an ale stake above her wooden door to signal that a fresh, safe batch was ready, inviting vulnerable neighbors directly into her own humble kitchen to share a hygienic drink and a brief moment of communal peace. Inside those incredibly cramped wattle and daub domestic rooms, the thick wood smoke and flickering rushlight offered a rare, desperately needed psychological shield against a profoundly harsh and entirely uncertain medieval world. The simple act of crossing that domestic threshold provided immediate physical safety from freezing winter temperatures and roaming nocturnal predators. Imagine the constant, suffocating fear of living in an agricultural era where sudden waterborne sickness, localized crop famine, and the looming catastrophic shadow of the bubonic plague were terrifying everyday realities. The unmapped world immediately outside the familiar village boundary was a vast, terrifying unknown filled with legitimate physical dangers, and average human life expectancy rarely stretched past 35 brutally hard years. In that terrifying daily reality, the local alehouse became the literal and figurative only light in the dark, serving as a vital community lifeline where terrified peasant neighbors could physically huddle together around a central hearth for critical warmth and mutual reassurance. Passing a large wooden drinking vessel from hand to hand and sharing a drink from a common cup was not just a casual social act. It was a desperate, necessary physical affirmation that they had successfully survived another punishing day. This repeated shared evening ritual slowly forged an unbreakable psychological bond of mutual economic and social reliance, permanently transforming a simple domestic kitchen into the undisputed beating heart of the entire medieval village. These informal living room gatherings laid the crucial foundational groundwork for what would eventually become a highly regulated national institution. As the centuries passed and the 17th century arrived, a completely new kind of struggle emerged across the British landscape, the sheer, unadulterated terror of overland travel. Picture the deep, pitch-black fear of riding an unsprung horse-drawn cart along deeply rutted, unpaved dirt roads, miles from any established settlement, with freezing rain lashing your face and the constant, very real threat of armed highwaymen hiding in the dense forest shadows. Every single mile advanced was a perilous physical test of human endurance until, finally, the thoroughly exhausted traveller spotted the brightly painted, swinging wooden sign of a roadside coaching inn cutting through the violent storm. Bearing heraldic symbols like the red lion or the white hart, that painted light was an absolute promise of physical salvation, acting as a crucial beacon, signaling that the passengers would not freeze to death or be violently ambushed in the dark. Surviving the treacherous multi-day journey explicitly meant pushing horses to their absolute physical limits to reach that heavy wooden door before the sun completely disappeared below the horizon. This specific architectural threshold marked the exact geographical point where the unpredictable, chaotic terror of the open road abruptly and permanently ended for the night. These expanding coaching inns were deliberately engineered exactly like defensive military fortresses to keep traveling merchants and mail carriers completely safe from the escalating violence of the rural highway. They featured massive 3-foot-thick stone walls and heavily gated cobblestone inner courtyards where highly vulnerable relay horses, expensive carriages, and valuable commercial cargo were securely locked away from organized gangs of thieves. Inside the main taproom, massive log fires roared constantly in enormous brick hearths, slowly thawing out frozen travelers while wealthy merchants, local tenant farmers, and weary postal riders from completely different socio-economic walks of life freely mixed together. The coaching inn rapidly became a vital, bustling intersection of national news, physical safety, and shared humanity, effectively bridging the vast, dangerous geographical gaps between highly isolated provincial towns. The simple, desperately sought act of stepping through those heavily fortified wooden gates instantly transformed a disparate group of frightened, exhausted wanderers into a tightly knit, temporary family. Sitting shoulder to shoulder over hot stew and strong ale, they were deeply united by the immense, overwhelming psychological relief of simply arriving at their destination completely alive. The world outside the traditional coaching inn suddenly shifted, violently and without mercy, as the late 18th century brought an unprecedented upheaval. The quiet agricultural countryside was swiftly swallowed by the brutal shock of the Industrial Revolution, replacing sweeping green fields with a suffocating blanket of black soot and sprawling brick mills. The sky over rapidly expanding cities like Manchester and Birmingham darkened permanently under the smoke of thousands of coal-fired chimneys, while the deafening roar of giant iron textile looms drowned out the ancient rhythms of rural life. Human beings, once intimately tied to the soil and the changing seasons, were abruptly stripped of their individuality and treated merely as cheap, replaceable cogs in a massive, grinding engine of global economic progress. This sudden, unnatural mechanization of daily survival fundamentally severed the working class from their ancestral villages and traditional support structures. The immense psychological toll of this rapid urbanization demanded a completely new kind of sanctuary that could somehow replace the lost communal hearth of the rural alehouse within an incredibly harsh, unforgiving urban landscape. Imagine the deepest, most bone-weary burnout you have ever felt, and multiply that sheer physical exhaustion by 100. During the peak of the 1830s, men, women, and even children endured punishing 14 to 16-hour shifts in highly dangerous, unventilated factories, leaving their bodies broken by repetitive strain and their minds entirely numb from the relentless noise. When these shattered workers finally stumbled out into the cold, damp night air, they had absolutely nowhere else to go. Their hastily constructed homes were nothing more than overcrowded, disease-ridden slums where multiple families shared single freezing rooms without basic sanitation, leaving the brightly lit local pub as their only genuine escape from the crushing weight of abject poverty. The heavy tavern door became the absolute only threshold in the entire sprawling industrial city where a nameless factory hand could step inside, find a roaring coal fire, and successfully reclaim their stolen humanity by being recognized as a distinct individual rather than a mere extension of a steam-powered machine. To absorb this immense collective trauma, the actual physical architecture of the British pub began to drastically change during the mid-19th century, physically moulding itself to fit increasingly desperate human needs. Astute publicans realized their diverse patrons required different kinds of refuge, leading to the ingenious architectural invention of distinct, separated rooms contained entirely within the exact same building. Heavy mahogany walls and elaborately etched frosted glass screens were strategically erected to create the public bar for rowdy, soot-stained camaraderie, alongside the much smaller snug designed for quiet, private conversations away from prying eyes. These beautiful Victorian partitions were not just decorative design choices, but vital emotional shields built to protect the fragile dignity of the working class from public scrutiny. The physical building itself essentially became a customized, brilliantly illuminated fortress against the relentless miseries of the industrial age, offering a highly structured, meticulously designed environment where exhausted laborers could selectively filter out the overwhelming chaos, noise, and grime of the crowded urban streets just beyond the frosted window panes. Within these carved wooden walls, the pub started doing the heavy lifting for entire neglected neighborhoods that lacked any formal government support or basic social services. It was never merely a place to purchase a cheap pint of ale, but rather the undisputed beating heart of the community's mutual survival network, stepping in where the state had completely failed its citizens. The corner tavern transformed into an unofficial local hospital where elders shared traditional folk medicine and remedies, and it served as the only reliable post office for countless laborers who could not read or write. It simultaneously functioned as the neighborhood penny bank, the headquarters for early trade unions, and the primary employment exchange, all operating seamlessly beneath the warm, inviting glow of newly installed gaslight. Every crucial administrative and social function of a healthy society, ranging from basic financial lending and grassroots political organizing to emergency healthcare and informal mail delivery, was effectively compressed into a single, smoky, public room filled with the deeply familiar scent of spilled ale, damp wool, and burning coal. But this profound daily gathering of working-class strength soon triggered a powerful new threat from above. The wealthy industrialists and the ruling political elite looked at these crowded, vibrant pubs and felt a deep, creeping terror at the sight of so many impoverished laborers uniting in one place, terrified that these independent taverns would become breeding grounds for violent revolutionary movements like Chartism. Paralyzed by the persistent fear of a violent political rebellion echoing across the English Channel, the government decided to fiercely crack down on the absolute only space the urban workers actually controlled. Local magistrates introduced strict, punishing new licensing laws designed specifically to monitor civilian behavior, heavily restrict opening hours, and systematically shut down any taverns that dared to host independent political thought or union meetings. The vital neighborhood sanctuary was suddenly under relentless, highly organized legal siege, by the exact same wealthy authorities who had originally forced the rural workers into the dangerous urban factories. This aggressive legislation effectively criminalized the very spaces and the only coping mechanisms these exhausted laborers had managed to build for their own survival. This aggressive legal assault from the state was quickly joined by a rising moral crusade during the mid-19th century known as the temperance movement. Well-meaning but dangerously misguided groups of middle-class citizens marched through the industrial streets, determined to close the pubs entirely because they falsely believed that cheap alcohol was the sole root cause of all society's visible suffering. These reformers completely failed to understand that by trying to forcefully tear down the public house, they were not fixing the broken community, but actively destroying its absolute only remaining safety net. The temperance crusaders heavily targeted the visible symptom of the workers' profound pain while deliberately blinding themselves to the crushing, systemic industrial poverty that made the warmth of the pub so absolutely necessary in the first place. In their highly righteous, incredibly short-sighted attempt to morally cure the nation of its perceived sins, these zealous crusaders threatened to permanently strip away the absolute only source of physical warmth, financial support, and basic human dignity that the exploited working class had left in a remarkably cold and indifferent world. There is a profound, almost invisible magic built into the very architecture of the classic wooden bar counter, which often stretched 30 feet across the room and featured a solid mahogany top. It is a seemingly simple piece of Victorian carpentry, yet it acts as a great social equalizer, instantly stripping away the rigid titles, professional ranks, and economic classes that strictly dictate life outside those heavy oak doors. When you sit shoulder to shoulder with a complete stranger, staring straight ahead at the glowing rows of spirit bottles and the large mirror behind the bar rather than directly into each other's eyes, a rare and unexpected kind of vulnerability takes hold. Leaning your weight against that deeply scratched, beer-stained wood removes the pressure of direct social confrontation, making it infinitely easier to confess your deepest fears to someone you met only an hour ago. That worn timber edge essentially became a secular, silent confessional for the British public, quietly absorbing generations of whispered hopes, deep financial anxieties, and quiet romantic defeats long before modern therapy even existed to handle the heavy psychological burdens of the working class. But that familiar sanctuary would soon face the absolute darkest test of the 20th century as the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 completely broke over the nation. The once loud, joyous rooms filled with rowdy laughter and evening song were suddenly drained of their young men as local volunteer regiments shipped out to the continent, leaving behind an eerie, heavy silence that suffocated the remaining patrons. The local pub quickly transformed into a grim, communal waiting room for grief, where anxious mothers and aging fathers gathered closely by the coal fireplace for warmth and news. They sat for hours with untouched pints of mild ale, their eyes fixed on the latest War Office casualty lists pinned directly to the wooden notice board, waiting in absolute dread to see if their sons were ever coming home from the Western Front. The devastating human toll of the muddy trenches, particularly after mass casualty events like the Battle of the Somme, permanently altered the fundamental soul of these spaces. The empty stools and missing regulars turned thousands of neighborhood taverns into living, breathing memorials for a completely lost generation of young British men. While local families mourned, the British government saw an unprecedented opportunity to tighten its moral and economic grip on the working class under the strict guise of wartime necessity. Fearing that too much alcohol would slow down the critical production of artillery shells and rifle bullets in the munitions factories, officials like David Lloyd George launched a direct legislative assault on the pub's daily rhythms through the Defence of the Realm Act. They introduced strict new laws that drastically cut the hours a pub could stay open, instituting a mandatory afternoon closure that forced doors to lock right when exhausted shift workers needed a drink the most. They even mandated that the beer itself be literally watered down by reducing its original gravity, fundamentally altering the strength of the traditional pint to ensure factory laborers remained entirely sober and highly productive for the relentless war machine. This calculated dilution of both the physical drink and the operating hours fundamentally shifted the neighborhood pub from a totally free social sanctuary to a heavily regulated state asset. In places like Carlisle, the government even nationalized the breweries and taverns completely, strictly dictating exactly how and when citizens were allowed to consume their alcohol. Yet, it was during the terrifying nights of the Second World War, beginning in the autumn of 1940, that the true, unbreakable spirit of the pub was permanently cemented into the British psyche. As the German Luftwaffe relentlessly rained incendiary fire down upon London during the Blitz, entire historic streets and countless residential blocks were reduced overnight to jagged piles of burning rubble and choking white plaster dust. Inside the surviving pubs, heavy blackout curtains and thick wooden boards were nailed tightly shut over the shattered windows to hide the warm interior light from enemy bombers circling in the dark skies above. Despite the brick walls violently shaking and the terrifying sound of air raid sirens wailing outside, someone would always sit down at the battered corner piano, leading a chorus of defiant, roaring voices through popular wartime songs that absolutely refused to be silenced by the aerial terror. This spontaneous act of communal singing was not just simple evening entertainment, but a highly effective, vital psychological defense mechanism against the relentless destruction falling from the clouds. The shared rhythm and loud melodies helped mask the terrifying whistle of falling bombs, allowing terrified neighbors to borrow courage from one another until the morning all-clear signal finally sounded. When the sun finally rose on the raw, smoke-filled mornings after a heavy raid, smelling strongly of cordite and broken gas mains, the immediate instinct was not just to check one's own home, but to navigate the shattered, glass-strewn streets toward the local pub. The tavern instantly became the unofficial headquarters for neighborhood survival, acting as a crucial central registry and the only reliable place to find out exactly who had made it through the night alive. Exhausted neighbors covered in thick grey dust from collapsed ceilings would push through the surviving saloon doors, their desperate eyes rapidly scanning the crowded, soot-stained room. The sudden, overwhelming tears of relief upon spotting a familiar face drinking a restorative cup of tea across the bar proved that the pub was no longer just a casual place to drink, but the absolute beating heart of the community's physical and emotional survival. Those desperate morning reunions amidst the wreckage forged an incredibly deep emotional bond between the British people and their local tavern that no future government regulation or economic hardship could ever truly break. The shared trauma of the Blitz forever elevated the pub from a simple commercial business into a sacred community institution. But the immediate aftermath of the war brought a completely new, unforeseen threat, as ambitious city planners in the 1950s and 1960s began to sweep away the extensive bomb damage to build a modern, highly efficient future. They eagerly replaced the tight, winding Victorian streets with massive, cold concrete housing estates, and they deliberately built shiny, vastly spacious new pubs to match this brutalist architectural vision. These vast, sterile rooms were designed with clinical mid-century precision, featuring harsh fluorescent lighting, extensive linoleum floors, and easily wiped surfaces, but they completely misunderstood fundamental human nature. The urban planners failed to realize that the true soul of a pub relies heavily on dark, intimate corners, close physical quarters, and decades of accumulated history, leaving these massive new buildings feeling acoustically hollow and entirely empty of genuine warmth. In systematically stripping away the comforting shadows, the tarnished brass fittings, and the worn, familiar wooden edges that had safely anchored generations of working-class drinkers, the modernist architects had accidentally built a structurally perfect, highly efficient public house, but they had entirely forgotten to include the beating human soul. Today, the psychological need for these shared physical spaces is more desperate than ever, yet we find ourselves increasingly isolated, staring into the cold glow of smartphone screens in entirely silent living rooms. The modern digital world has aggressively traded the noisy, chaotic warmth of the traditional local taproom for the sterile convenience of virtual connection, leaving millions profoundly disconnected. This quiet social crisis is compounded by a ruthless opposing economic force, as large, faceless property development companies buy up historic local pubs, only to systematically strip them of their architectural soul. These developers tear out the worn carpets, mahogany fittings and familiar corners, rapidly converting centuries of irreplaceable community heritage into sterile luxury apartments or brightly lit chain supermarkets. As these aggressive corporate acquisitions accelerate across both sprawling cities and remote rural villages, the very foundational architecture of British social life is being dismantled brick by brick. Recent industry data reveals that hundreds of these historic institutions vanish every single year, permanently erasing the geographical centres of countless local communities. The physical reality of this staggering cultural loss is a heartbreaking sight on any high street, marked by heavy wooden boards nailed across once welcoming bay windows and fading signs swinging in the wind. A permanently closed pub is not simply a failed commercial business venture, but rather the sudden traumatic amputation of a neighbourhood's central social organ. Think of the lonely pensioner who used to sit in the far corner booth every Tuesday afternoon, slowly nursing a single pint of mild ale just to hear the comforting sound of other human voices. When those heavy oak doors are padlocked shut by liquidators and the warm yellow lights go out for good, where exactly is he supposed to go? That sudden, echoing silence leaves the most vulnerable members of society completely adrift, abruptly severing the fragile daily lifelines that kept them securely anchored to the outside world. Without the watchful eye of the publican or the casual greetings of regular patrons, the invisible safety net of the entire community instantly unravels. But directly against this relentless tide of corporate erasure, a miraculous modern comeback is rapidly taking root across the country. Everyday people are fiercely refusing to let their historic sanctuaries die, organizing highly coordinated grassroots campaigns and leveraging new community rights legislation to legally reclaim the physical spaces that define their hometowns. Neighbors who previously barely knew each other are now actively knocking on doors, emptying their modest personal savings accounts and pooling thousands of pounds to buy these threatened buildings outright. They are officially forming registered community benefit societies, issuing local shares, and transforming regular weekend patrons into proud, collective shareholders of their own tangible history. This unprecedented fight for cultural survival reached a remarkable defining milestone in 2023, when official campaign records showed that over 150 pubs across the United Kingdom had been successfully rescued and reopened by the very people who drink in them. From the remote Scottish Highlands to the dense suburbs of London, these cooperative ventures boast an astonishing survival rate. The triumphant, emotional moment these dedicated communities finally unlock the heavy front doors of their newly owned pubs is absolutely electric. Thick dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through freshly cleaned leaded glass windows as generations of locals step back into a beloved space that is now undeniably and permanently theirs to protect. These new citizen landlords spend their precious weekends covered in overalls, painstakingly painting the faded plaster walls together, sanding down the deeply scarred mahogany bar, and repairing the wobbly cast-iron table bases. Amid the potent smells of fresh varnish and spilled old ale, there are genuine tears of joy, representing a massive release of collective tension after months of fierce legal battling. This intense collective physical labor completely rewires the fundamental atmosphere of the taproom, permanently cementing an unbreakable psychological bond between the everyday patrons and the ancient bricks that shelter them. Every painted skirting board and polished brass handle becomes a lasting testament to their shared neighborhood defiance. This long, financially exhausting journey to save these historic buildings reveals a deep, undeniable revelation about the core nature of the British institution itself. The massive community mobilization proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the traditional public house was never actually primarily about the consumption of alcoholic drinks. The bitter ale and the dry cider were merely the socially acceptable excuses to gather, acting as the historical lubricant for the essential human machinery of daily connection. The true architectural purpose was always to provide a perfectly level cultural ground where every single person, from the wealthy local magistrate to the exhausted factory worker, belonged to a living ecosystem much larger than themselves. Even if completely stripped of its alcohol, the physical space remains a critically vital emotional refuge for the isolated, proving conclusively that what modern people are really thirsting for is simply the reassuring presence of each other. It is the ultimate antidote to the crushing loneliness of the 21st century. When you next walk into one of these enduring, community-saved spaces, look very closely at the specific physical details that have somehow survived the brutal march of centuries. Run your hand along the heavily tarnished brass footrail where millions of tired feet have rested, and trace your fingers over the deep, jagged scratches permanently gouged into the heavy oak bar top. In those quiet, reflective moments before the evening rush begins, you can almost feel the invisible ghosts of the Victorian past standing shoulder to shoulder with the living patrons of today. Every single burn mark and scuff on that highly polished wood tells an undocumented story of a wartime celebration, a sudden heartbreak, a whispered political secret, or an entire vibrant life lived fully within these four walls. These countless physical scars serve as the permanent, unwritten archives of everyday human existence, perfectly preserving the collective memory of absolutely everyone who ever pushed open those heavy wooden doors and sought shared comfort from the bitter cold outside. This long history of survival forged a unique set of social codes that quietly defined the modern British character. Inside these walls, a subtle system of fairness emerged, teaching generations how to stand together when the outside world felt uncertain. The unwritten rules of the pub became the rules of society itself. Buying a round of drinks, patiently waiting your turn at a crowded bar, and keeping a watchful eye on your neighbours were not just polite habits. They were a profound education in community, establishing a shared understanding that everyone was equal once they crossed the threshold. That fierce commitment to a shared space eventually bled outward, cementing the pub as a recognized civic institution rather than just a commercial business. By the late 20th century, this cultural weight forced a change in how local governments viewed these historic buildings. Planners and lawmakers began officially listing historic taverns as assets of community value, legally protecting them from being quietly bulldozed into luxury apartments. The local watering hole had finally been recognized in the eyes of the law as a vital piece of the national infrastructure, as essential to a neighborhood as a school or a clinic. Yet, this legal recognition arrived too late for countless communities that had already seen their historic anchors vanish overnight. The sudden closure of a neighborhood pub left a profound void, severing the daily lifelines of elderly residents who relied on the publican for their only regular conversation. Without that central meeting point, local sports teams dissolved, charity fundraisers lost their headquarters, and the informal support networks that kept working-class families afloat quietly fractured. The human cost of a boarded-up door was measured in creeping isolation, as people lost the one warm room where they were always expected and always welcome. This wave of closures triggered a profound shift in how the nation valued its remaining public houses, culminating in a modern movement of radical community ownership. In 2003, the residents of Hescott Newmarket in Cumbria took an unprecedented step when their local landlord retired. Rather than let the old crown fall into the hands of corporate developers, more than 100 villagers pooled their own savings to buy the property outright. This historic action shattered the assumption that a pub must be a private enterprise, proving that a determined community could become the permanent guardian of its own heritage. Today, as modern life pushes us further into digital isolation, a quiet anxiety lingers over the future of these ancient gathering places. We are left to wonder if the deep, messy, face-to-face connection that the pub demands can survive in an era that constantly prioritizes convenience over community. The historical record shows us that the tavern survived plagues, wars, and industrial revolutions, but it cannot tell us if it will survive our modern retreat into the glowing screens of our own homes. The ultimate fate of the great British public house remains an open, unanswered question, resting entirely on whether future generations will still feel the primal urge to share a room with strangers. Despite this uncertainty, the blueprint of the British pub has already left a permanent mark on global hospitality. The fundamental concept of a cozy, egalitarian space anchored by a wooden bar has been exported to every corner of the world, from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. It established a universal standard for what a public sanctuary should feel like, proving that the desire for a warm hearth and a shared drink transcends cultural boundaries. The architectural DNA of the village alehouse has become a global institution, a lasting testament to a small island nation's genius for creating comfort in a cold world. Back on those rain-swept streets where the tradition was born, the physical landscape of the surviving pubs still tells the story of the people who held on to them. Glowing amber windows still cut through the damp winter fog, casting long shadows across wet cobblestones and modern pavements alike. Inside, the low hum of overlapping voices and the clinking of heavy glasses continue to provide a vital refuge for those seeking shelter from the isolation of modern city life. When the rain finally begins to fall on a dark, quiet street, that warm glow spilling from the corner window is much more than just a place to buy a drink. If you trace your hand along the worn brass rail of the bar or run your fingers over the deep, uneven scratches in the heavy oak tables, you are touching centuries of shared human survival. It is a quiet, enduring promise, polished by millions of hands and carved into the very bones of the building, that no matter how cold or uncertain the world outside becomes, there will always be a fire lit, a glass poured, and a seat waiting for you inside.